Well, we're on our second last talk, and for the most part it will be all animal lore tonight. Highfalutin animal lore, but animal lore nonetheless. We left off last time with the famous classical part of the story of Isis, and that is where Osiris is cut into 14 pieces. And we talked about that in terms of distribution. And especially we talked about it in terms of distribution through concentration and meditation. In the story itself, we had Typhon finding the body of Horus under a full moon and tearing it into 14 pieces and distributing it all about Egypt. Isis finds the different pieces and collects them together, with the exception of the phallus, which has been eaten by the fishes. According to some variants of the story, each piece is located in the temple of Osiris, and each temple is in the city that is the capital of a nome. And in some variants, she puts them all together and makes a gold phallus and puts little models, little images of Osiris in the various different temples, so that to confuse Typhon if he does win over Horus and goes looking for Osiris to tear him apart again. Now, we talked a lot about distribution. What we didn't talk about, this is going back to what I forgot to say or what I should have said last time, is we forgot about the lost phallus being one of the most famous things in all mysticism, because the lost phallus is the lost creative potency that we had when we fell and were distributed into being very separatist, specialized people. In the Garden of Eden, before the fall, we had the power to name the animals, and we therefore could be creative formers of the species as they became and as they developed. And so the lost phallus of Osiris is very much like the famous lost word of Freemasonry, or the lost tone, or the lost chord of esoteric music, or the hidden dimension of art. And so it was the lost word which caused us to now live in a shallow world where we can't seem to get that inner side of things. We did, however, talk about that center, or the concentration that leads to the penetration into the inner hidden core of all things. That is, if we persist in trying to go more and more inward and become more and more concentrated, we can penetrate back into the heart of creative existence and get into that core or nucleus where all things come about. So the whole, where we left off last week, was a gigantic pitch for concentration as the source of meditation and concentration for getting back to the creative activity. When we get back to the story of Isis and Osiris, there is a major shift of emphasis. It's the second major shift of emphasis, in that in the first part of the story, everything focused on Osiris, his journeys and his educational efforts and all of that. Then at the death of Osiris, or at the entombment of Osiris, then everything shifts to Isis. And now, when the body of Osiris is reassembled again, or collected, which is the opposite word from distribution, everything shifts to Horus. Osiris comes to Horus in the story out of the invisible. And he works with him or through him to prepare in his battle of vengeance with Typhon. And what happens is Osiris starts talking to Horus, and he asks him two questions. The first question, what does he consider the most fair act one can do? In this sense, fair meaning justice, in the Platonistic sense of justice, harmonizing the whole. And Horus says, helping father and mother in ill plight, which means serving the divine father and serving the divine mother in the ill plight, which is the manifestation, meaning to say they're no longer in the pure, undifferentiated spiritual sleep. The second question Osiris puts to Horus is, what animal does he think most useful to those who go out to fight? And immediately, almost without thought, Horus says, horse. A lion is a powerful thing when you need the force, but with a horse you can scatter a foe to pieces and then you can consume them utterly. When Osiris hears this, he rejoices and he disappears, feeling that Horus is fitly prepared to do battle with Typhon. In this case, the invisible or underworld, when it says Osiris came out of the invisible, can be understood, of course, on several levels. In the simple way, it is out of the realm of the dead. In another way, it is in the transcendent realm, as opposed to the phenomenal realm, where we in our thoughts and emotions live. We live in phenomenal existence, whereas the spirit is invisible to that and is sensed only with the intuitive sense of spirit, and it is hence invisible even to the world of thought and the world of emotion. And in another level yet, it is the ever-invisible realm of the divine spirit, which can never be seen. It can only be kenned. You can only know that it is there. And the way you usually know it is through the light that emanates from it, that is the life spirit, and in the beauty and in the luminosity of that light do you sense the power that is behind it. Now, when there is an initiation, or when there is a divine marriage, before that takes place, there is usually what is called, in the Egyptian sense, the Hermetic dialogue. It is the dialogue between the teacher and the student, and in that, as in the story, Osiris is trying to determine the readiness. As Hamlet says, the readiness is the all. And so Osiris is trying to determine whether Horus is ready for the initiation. It's because initiation is such a powerful experience that for someone who isn't ready for it, it can be utterly destructive rather than being a creative activity. All one needs to do is read Zanoni to see how overwhelming it can be, and that's even mild as expressed there. Some people die in horror when they see some of the things of the spiritual worlds. So it is a dialogue. Oh no. So this is inwardly, because initiation is an inward process, This is the dialogue within. And it is the dialogue within that has become very harmonious and very helpful and fulfilling. Right now, quite a bit of the dialogue within is because we, as we see ourselves in our lower egoistical state, we want to do our thing and we're selfish, and despite the pleadings or despite the admonitions or the exhortation of the Spirit, we want to do our own thing, and so it turns out to be a very ugly argument. And when we learn to tame ourselves, it gets to be that we can ask whatever kind of questions we will, or have whatever questions asked of us that are important, and it becomes a wonderful source of information. Truly, when we get into the deeper levels of concentration and meditation, it is that. We're going right to the core of things, and we're getting the answers that cannot be gotten by mere sense perception or anything of that type. So it is a two-way kind of thing. It's not just a communication, really. It is the essence of what is called assimilation. We've said before that the term assimilation is a very technical term, meaning bringing into connection similars. And then in the process of assimilation, or in this Hermetic dialogue, there is an attunement of everything phenomenal with its parent principle in the Spirit. And the Spirit is enriched by the experience that has come from the phenomenal, which it cannot experience in the transcendent state, and the phenomenal is enriched by understanding the meaning or the whys or the intent of the divine in the first place in the creative activity. And so with this, one has a totally healthy soul, in that the personality feels worthy rather than just serving itself. Anytime somebody lives a selfish existence, they always despise themselves. But if one realizes that one is serving the divine and really has something to offer to God, and there is that assimilation or that connection with the truth on a higher transcendent level, the lower part, the personality, becomes much more self-respecting. And the higher is enriched by the soul food that it gets, and it fulfills its basic nature, which is to give. Spirit cannot help but to create. It cannot help but to give. It cannot help but to outpour. And so this kind of interaction is of that nature. Now, it's time to start talking about animals, which is where we're going to spend most of the evening. Several years ago, when we looked a little bit into Hindu mythology, we looked at the concept of the Vahan. And that Vahan was an animal that represented the divinity that it served, but it was more than just a representative, it was a vehicle. So the Vahan animals are symbols, and they're more than symbols, because something of the living nature of the spiritual being that expresses through or rides on the Vahan is carried through into the animal, and the animal itself gives it expression, and it points to something essential in the divinity. The animal sort of then is like a scout for the divinity, as well as a means to be in touch with the divinity. The animal that you could call the Vahan of Horus is the hawk. And I have a picture here that I'll pass around. It's in the part where all this insert is. It's a picture of the blessings of Osiris and Typhon being poured onto the candidate for initiation. On the left is the Ask God Typhon, and on the right is the hawk god Horus. And I'll just pass it around, and you can have a look at it. There's a lot in the picture if you want to look at it. Even in the geometric dimensions, there's a lot there. Horus, though not the high sun like Re or Ra, is associated with the sun. The fact that the sun rises up from the east and reaches a pinnacle and then comes down is seen to be exactly like what the hawk does. The hawk slowly climbs upward and then it dives downward. And that is key to understanding part of the association of Horus with the sun, or a Horus with the hawk, both together. The Egyptians kept time by the position of Horus in his ascent and in his dive. And it is from this that we have all of those words like horology, meaning the study of time, or horary, meaning the horoscope of the hour, or hour itself comes from Horus, or even a horoscope is the chart of the hour, or is the chart of the position of Osiris in the day. So what we're talking about is the division of time by the passage of the sun's light. The position of Horus in the ascendant represents the portention of the might of the sun as a victor over darkness and as the source of all of the mighty heat and light that are going to be ours in the center of the day. So the vehicle or Vahan relationship of Horus with the hawk is much more than that to the Egyptians, because they saw the sun not merely associated with Horus, but they saw the sun as the eye of Horus. And literally, that is the light, that you can't see the bird because the eye is so bright, the light coming out of the eye is so bright that you can't even see the bird. The part of this is due to the fact that some scholars would say that the Egyptians were fools, and if you look in raptors, they had that eyelid that closes over the eye, and it looks white, as though there were light coming out there, as though there were a shield of light. And the modern scholars think that, the fools the Egyptians were. They thought that when they saw that, they thought that they were blinking the light out, and that it was a false belief to think that the light comes out of the eye of the hawk. A raptor is the whole family of birds that are hawks and vultures and condors. And no, not quite. I don't think the owls are considered raptors. And the smallest member of that family is the condor minimum. That's a pun.
What's condors and what?
Vultures, eagles. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. The double eyelid. Yeah. And the Egyptians were certainly aware of the close association between the spherical eye as the receptor of light and the spherical sun as the source of light. They may have, even with their seership, been aware of the relationship of the eye made as a receptive image of the sun to receive light, because the sun had to be there before the eye could evolve, because you can't evolve to an eye where there is no light for it to evolve toward. But the Egyptians, with their esoteric knowledge, were not wrong, because they knew that in the depth of concentration, that when one learns to take the redirected spinal energy and to focus it out the optic nerve, a lot of the esoteric wisdom is involved with learning to direct energy straight out of the cranial nerves. The 12 cranial nerves are considered to be the 12 gates of Jerusalem, or of the New Jerusalem in the Apocalypse. And the optic nerve is one of the first that is activated in the process of esoteric development, and one is able then to direct out through the optic nerve a stream of light. You can see it in very intense people. You can see it comes out as much as almost a half an inch. It is a little, often red little rod of light that sticks right out of a person's eye. Unfortunately for some people, it comes out when they're blazingly angry. It's where that source of that notion of sacré le bleu comes from the French. And so the Egyptians were not wrong. So this whole idea was associated with the fact then that the hawks and the eagles and such, by flying high like that, came closest to the sun. And the Egyptian bird lore was that that eagle, in order to become an adult eagle, had to be able to look the sun in the eye by having enough energy coming out of its own eye. This is one of the secrets of that if you don't know it, you can go blind. But in esoteric initiation, when you have some of your maiden spiritual experiences, this is the way you can look the sun directly in the eye and not be blinded, because you have as much light coming out of your eye as goes into it. This I can say that I know for a fact that you can, if you are in the right state of consciousness with the energy pouring out of yourself. You can literally look into the sun for 20 minutes at a time. However, whether it's a wise thing to do or not, I don't know. It's, if I'm going to be pouring out my light, I'm just not going to be spending it looking at the sun. But I don't want to, we're getting into territory I don't want to get too far into. So, boy, I have really dirty glasses and I can't even see these teeny tiny notes. So it is the fresh new light in the east that is represented by Horus the hawk. Now the Vahan, or vehicle relationship of animal to God, goes much more deep than that. It penetrates into the desire world. Clairvoyance would see the group spirits, that is the godly archangelic group spirits of the animals, very much like the picture. They would see them in a human form, meaning to say that their general consciousness has passed through the human state, but with the head being the head of an ass or being the head of a hawk, shows where their waking consciousness is focused. And so the group spirits of the animals work from the desire world. And a clairvoyant would see them that way. So in one way, the image of Horus the hawk is literally the vehicle of the archangelic group spirit. It expresses itself directly through the desire world, into the desire body, the animal, and into the physical world. So like in all lore, like Native American lore or Tibetan lore, where they talk about animals having powers, even the powers inherent in the flesh of different parts of their body. This is because a specific kind of consciousness has gone into the formation of that body and has worked through that body, and that by getting in touch with that animal, you can get in touch with the group spirit of that animal, and in a way you can have the power of that archangelic divinity, its flavor, its astrological flavor, be a source of knowledge and a source of power to you. So it really is a true power when they talk about power animals. There is another way of talking about the world of animals, the desire world, because, of course, we know another name for the desire world is the astral realm. And it is through the astral realm, not through electromagnetism, but some of it does work down through electromagnetism, but it is through the astral realm that the gods focus the influences that we know work from astrology. They're pouring out these different forces into the desire world, into the world of the animals, into the world of the group spirits, and there they influence us. So the desire world, or the astral world, is the world of the zodiac. It is the world of the animals, or the circle of animals in that whole circle. Now, we're examining Horus as the hawk, as one of the representations or manifestations of the desire world and its denizens as expressed directly into the physical world. And the hawk as the sun was a really powerful thing. There's an enormous amount of heat and light that is associated with the sun in Egypt. Now, in the zodiac, heat and light are associated with the fiery signs. And the fiery signs are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. We have been speaking of the fresh, new light of Horus the hawk ascending in power. And that is the Horus is represented as the hawk as Aries. So now the answer to the second question has all three elements of the fiery and light triplicity. It has Horus as the avenger, the rising up, the youth, the almost immature, brash nature of Horus, and that as the hawk. And then we have the might of the lion, but the ultimate power being associated with Sagittarius. So we're talking about Horus then. The Hermetic dialogue then spans all of the fiery signs. Now this doesn't contradict the fact that the other martial sign, Scorpio, is also associated with raptors. They are exclusively meat and fish-eating animals, and so they are very much martial animals as birds. In fact, some people would make the distinction between the hawk and the condor, for example, or between the hawk and the vulture, in that the hawk would be like the positive station of Mars, that is Aries, in that it would eat live, raw meat. Just like the Cooper's hawk that came to visit my bird feeder this winter. He was looking for live meat in the form of little birds. Whereas the vultures and buzzards and condors would be more associated with Scorpio because they are willing to, if not exclusively, live on dead meat. And remember when we talked about Heracles a few years ago, that he really liked the vultures because they never killed anything, and they cleaned everything up It's quite a good statement by him at that time. I have to say good things about Heracles because I have to provide parity to the universe for Ela, who doesn't think very highly of Heracles because he's just such a brute about things. But at any rate, so we see then in the three animals, the hawk being the rising, vicious animal, the lion being the sun in summer in all of its power and even all of its laziness, and finally we see the horse as being the transcendent wisdom that is associated with Sagittarius. Meaning to say then that with Sagittarius you have this broad universal consciousness that can cover everywhere. And with that you have a much greater vehicle than you have in a lion, which is sort of a sluggard. And it's like saying that this wide-ranging wisdom is much better than the concentrated heat of the sun, which will just stand there and beat down on you in the leonine state. It's like saying that when we concentrate, we develop heat and light, but when we get out of that concentration or through that concentration, when we expand, we distribute our consciousness to the whole. And when we have that consciousness of the whole, we have something that the scattered parts can be overcome. So we see part of the superiority then of the horse in the struggle. I'll get the notes all backwards here and have to do everything backwards as I did back in Oedipus. In spiritual philosophy, the principle of redundancy, just as in astrology the principle of redundancy does not weaken, but it magnifies, and it magnifies greatly. So when something is repeated and appears to be redundant, it is meant to be compounding and not diluting. So there is another principle that goes that character development, since the justice or the fairness spoken about in the first question is accomplished through balance, that only when the character is completely balanced and like the sun can radiate its strength in all directions equally at the same time, only then is it invulnerable, and only then can it do its maximum amount of good. So for us, because we are sort of strung out and very weak in our human condition, the strength of character depends upon overcoming and struggling with our weaknesses. Therefore, our attention and our strength is focused on our weakness, and the strength and the weakness turn out to be the same thing because the focus is in the same place. Now this is shown in the second answer of Horace, because the strong point of Typhon, representing matter, especially the dense physical matter, the strong point of Typhon is just exactly what he does to Osiris. He distributes it. But now twice we see that his strong point is also his weak point. Because if there is too great of distribution, like if there are all these little Osirises buried in all of these little temples, this leads to confusion. If you try to see which one is the real one in all the parts, all the little atoms, rather than homing in on the center and getting them all, it leads to confusion. Now here we find the same thing, is that Horus, the concentrated eye of the sun, realizes that when you concentrate, that you come to the expanded state of meditation, and in that expanded state of meditation, you surround and you subtend all the distributed parts, and then each of the distributed parts is easily overcome. Whereas if they're all concentrated in one, it's hard to overcome them. So the strong point of Typhon turns out to be the weak point at the same time. And it's interesting to note that in this that the way this is accomplished is by meeting something in what is both its strongest and its weakest point. Now, this way of looking at the Vahan of Horus the Hawk is G.R.S. Mead doesn't even look at this and won't even consider it at all. He takes the more classic one, which I don't care to go into, but I will mention it. He counterpoints the horse of light against the red mule, because if you remember, if you look at the picture again of Horus and Typhon, Typhon is pictured as a red ass, whereas Horus is pictured as a white hawk. And so these are sort of like the horses of the apocalypse, and this is actually the struggle between the purified and unpurified soul. The purified soul has the wings of transcendence and can take soul flights anywhere and everywhere and has this magnificent overall understanding, whereas the red ass is like the unpurified soul that is attached to the body, and it's stubborn. And in our stubbornness, it's hard for the Spirit to get us to do anything at all. And that's a perfectly good use of the looking at the horse versus the mule. But we won't go too much into that. I'm actually getting so I don't try to take up and do everything that's in the story. I'm realizing I can't do it all. Well, at this point, as I was pondering the notes, I decided that it was time for a very brief intermezzo into what we're doing, because we always have to go back and ask ourselves what we're doing. Now, it is true that one of the purposes of doing these talks is to be inspiration, so that we are inspired to contemplate divine things, lofty things that lift us out of our daily existence. However, part of the inspiration is not meant to be inspiration to very far-fetched things. It can't all be highfalutin stuff. It has to be the actual stuff. And so I just want to put a remembrance in here that it is important to ask ourselves in the struggle of Horus and Typhon that is taking place in ourselves, are we lighting the light of Horus? That is, are we doing the concentration each and every day? Are we penetrating so that our light is becoming a little bit stronger and a little bit more general? Because if we aren't, these talks certainly aren't going to help us at all, no matter how highfalutin they may try to be. In fact, I even have right outside of the room, a little room where I sleep in the hallway, I have a large picture of Mott's balance, which has the weighing of the soul against the feather. And I have it such that whether I consciously look at it every day, which I don't always do, it's there that when I go out to meet the world each and every day, the first thing I have to look at is Mott's balance. And it's saying to me, there is a judgment. And are you ready to stand the weighing of the soul and to take that kind of judgment? And it's a pretty good reminder to me. All right. Intermezzo is over. I'll not harp at you anymore tonight.
The feather of the heart against the soul.
Yeah. Mott is the Venus Libra of the older gods, in the same way that Nephthys is the Venus Earth, the Taurus Venus. Mott is the Venus Libra, and she has the balance. And when a person dies or when a person enters into the underworld as an initiate, one of the things that happens, the soul is put on a balance and it's weighed against the feather. And if the soul is heavier than the feather, then the person can't enter into the underworld. And both vehicles are there. Mercury as Hermanubis, the guard of the underworld, is there to do the judging, and the one that'll cart you away, I think it's the alligator god, is there that'll chew you up and swallow you up if you don't pass, if you're too heavy. The alligators don't like light meals at all. All right, back to the story. As soon as we get back to the story, the distribution and dispersion is already in play, because confusion is there even before the battle starts. What happens is that many of the followers of Typhon come over and join the forces of Horus. And among them is Typhon's own concubine, Theurus. She comes over, and Typhon gets so angry that he sends a serpent behind to gobble her up or to strike her. So we have some of the symbols, same symbols that we have here in the Orpheus myth of being trailed by a serpent at your feet. But what happens is that the companions of Horus take their swords and they cut the serpent into pieces. And that is such a significant thing that even down to the time of Plutarch, when they celebrate both the mysteries of Osiris, but especially when they celebrate the mysteries of Horus, what they do is they throw a rope down on the ground, and the priests of Horus cut the rope into pieces as remembrance of the time when the serpent was there. In the cosmos, there is not much lag anywhere. There's no slack anywhere. It isn't a matter of involution and then rest and ho-hum. Let's think about pausing for a while and then going with evolution. Nor is it a matter that there is distribution during the waning moon and then a stop, and then there is collection during the waxing moon. It is immediate. Things do slow down the deeper spirit gets into matter. They come down to so that it almost appears as though God is dead and as though everything is stopped. But there is really no stop. There isn't a lull. There is the leap of faith that we have to take to go from involution, where we are guided, all the way to evolution, where we become self-guided. But there really is no lull. So what we're talking about here in the switchover at the time of the battle is when the forces of Typhon come over and align themselves with Apollo. We're not talking about fickleness or faithlessness or anything like that, but what we're talking about is a voluntary realization that a new day has dawned and that there is a new order of things. And so there is a switch over, the very same thing that at the time of Christ that the Greek poets were saying. I realize that the time of following Saturn is done, and it's now time to follow Jupiter. The Greek poets were saying that the time of concentration down into matter is over, and now the time of expansion back into spirit is what is in order. So this is, it's not faithlessness. What is really interesting is that the Urus, the concubine of Typhon, should be one of those that switches over, because it brings in a lot of other kinds of meaning. Mead defers to Wallace Budd, the great Egyptologist, who identifies the Urus with Ta-urt, the hippopotamus goddess. So now we're going to talk about hippopotamus lore for a while. The theurus itself is again one of those wordplay things, and since I don't understand Greek, and I don't even have a hunch from any words that come from that root, I don't have a hunch of what's going on, so I just had to content myself with hippopotamus lore. In taxonomy, or in taxonomical evolution, the hippopotamus is fairly closely related to the pig. And like the pig, it has a huge, big body, and relative to the body, a tiny tail. Now, Balzac, the French author who was interested in the occult, in fact, he even wrote an occult novel called The Seraphita, which I have a copy of if you'd like to read it. It's not as occult as something like Zanoni or something like that. But he was also a Taurus, since we're talking about hippopotami and pigs in Taurus. In fact, he even looked pig-like, and he was sort of a gourmand, a glutton. But with greater wisdom than he may have known, said the good Lord put the smile of the dog in its tail. And that's, we're going to talk about tail lore now.
Wait, where's the connection between the pig's tail and the dog's?
Well, we're talking about because the dog expresses its smile through the tail rather than through the face. And we're trying to get to the fact that the hippopotamus of the tail. It's my one literary reference for the night. Please don't take it away from me. It's nothing but madness, sheer madness. But at any rate, in the animal kingdom, the cycle of spiritual energy that descends unconsciously down the spine gets activated in the sacrum or in the sacral area and reascends into the cranium. That round trip circuit is not complete in the animals. They don't have the self-consciousness to draw it back up the spine, and the group spirits working along the spine do try to bring it back up, but the spiritual evolution isn't there yet. So even in human beings, our bringing of the spiritual energy that is activated in the, you might call it, etheric spiritual gas of the spine is such that we don't bring it up, otherwise we would all be clairvoyant and we would be looking with at least 3 eyes rather than just 2. So with animals like the smiling dog, a lot of the energy is put out at the other end of the spine because it can't make the round trip. And this is done in 2 ways. Some of it goes into the fertilization of the fecal matter and in the urine. The uric acid that gets deposited in the brain of a human is associated with conscious volitional thought to overpower the world. So that when people become too phlegmatic and too accomplishing in the material world, what happens is they get too much uric acid kept in the body and in the head, and they have gout. But in the fecal matter and in the urine, we're not saying that uric acid necessarily is the spinal energy, but what is associated with it in the spine and at the base of the trunk, that energy, when it gets activated there in the lower center, it works through. In the animals, it goes into the fecal matter and it becomes the fertilizer for improving the growth of everything. So you might say it is the soul, the material soul in the material world. The part that doesn't go out in fecal matter goes out in the tail. so that dogs wag their tail as an expression, or deer, when they're panicked, raise their tail, or cats, when they're excited about something, they twitch their tail, or when they're angry, they slap it around. Now, what happens with pigs and hippopotami is they don't have enough of a shock absorber in the tail because the tail is so small. So they have to do something else with that cosmic creative power that would become fertilizer or expression through the tail. And what the pigs and hippopotami do is they absorb it and they put it into a huge amount of flesh. And this is where the notion comes from among the Buddhists that Buddha ate and died of eating too much pig's flesh, or that the heroes of the Norse were allowed to eat pig's flesh when they dined with Wotan in the inner world. That meant they were consuming wisdom. This is also, it's not merely because of trichinosis, and it's not merely because of the hooves of pigs that they were not eaten in ancient times. Those were considerations, but it was because the pig's flesh was considered sacred, because it was such excessive flesh. And it was excessive, meaning that there was a huge amount of cosmic wisdom. This, I believe, is the reason why Buddha is portrayed after his enlightenment as being big and fleshy. And this, among a lot of people, yet they see corpulence not as a bunch of overexpression in flesh that is sort of dying away and smelling bad or something like that. Corpulence is seen as, wow, this person carries with them a great deal of spiritual matter and a great deal of influence. Big people have that quality about them. And so the flesh then was considered a manifestation of cosmic wisdom. And it's all, so then the flesh becomes a shock absorber instead of the tail. And very often you find this among people who become very sensitive and very spiritual. They put on a lot of weight. They're not sensitive because they're big, but they're big because they're sensitive, because they need something to act as a shock absorber, because they don't have the types of personalities that are extroverted. They can pour that energy out into the world, and they just take it and take it and take it, and so they have the extra flesh or the extra water as shock absorption. Now, when you live in a climate like Egypt, where it is very hot, there is another thing that pigs and hippopotami have in common that dogs don't have. A dog can sweat through its tongue, but pigs and hippopotami do not have sweat glands. So when you have metabolic mass of the size of a hippopotamus, and you have the heat of the sun, because the Upper Egypt is right on the Tropic of Cancer. When you have the heat of the sun beating down on you like that and that much mass, you've got to find a way to get rid of the heat. Because if you don't get rid of the heat, you're going to die. Your body, the spirit can only live in a body when it's kept in a moderated temperature. And so what happens with the hippopotami is they wallow. Pigs also wallow. They do this to cool off. It looks like they really enjoy the mud and they love to get all smeary and all of that, but they're wallowing to cool off. What? Yes, but I don't know if buffaloes have sweat glands or not. My taxonomy is not very good. There are all kinds of things I like to go into, but I get too greedy for my own good, and I'm beginning to realize I'm not going to be able to study all the things I want. So I'd better unfold the clairvoyance so that I can have the thing where I can get zillions of pieces of information all in one moment. enough of this fiddling around, reading in books and concentrating on what the inner meaning of it is. And I want to get right to the good stuff. I want to wallow in it. But the wallowing then represented, in that watery, mucky state, represented the hippopotamus goddess, the Urus, represented that state between water and earth and the lively animating form or the lively animal form somewhere in between there. It represented a divine wisdom that functioned more as a cunning nature soul force, taking care of the things in the earth. So then Nephthys was a true goddess, but what she represented is the beauty in form, in matter. She was a Venus being. Typhon represented hardened, crystallized matter itself. But Nephthys, as the concubine who unites with Typhon, does not the beauty work that Nephthys does, but she gets herself dirty. And she takes care of the physical needs, the instinctual needs. She works with the wisdom of instinct. And for that reason, Nephthys is pictured when she's always carrying a little stick that carries on the end of it the symbol of protection and preservation. And she was then seen almost like a combination of Demeter and an earthly mother goddess that protected the things in nature. So, being privy to the knowledge in the soul worlds, in the animating soul worlds, she was aware of the change of the order of things, and so it's not surprising that the Urus would come over to the side of Horus, because really, truly, instinct doesn't want to be something that works against the intent and purposes of spirit, but wants to work with it. What we're talking about here is that literally we have to look for the hippopotamus goddess in ourselves. If we can become unnaturally spiritually aware such that our instincts, we don't appreciate our instincts because they are slimy and muddy and smeary and all like that. But at a certain point, when the battle is being raised, at a certain point we don't become otherworldly in our spirituality. But when we get right down to the fight, our instinctuality, our preservative interests come, and they themselves serve the self-conscious spirit represented by Horus. And this is an important thing, so that we shouldn't be fighting our instincts, but somehow we should revere our instincts in such a way that our respect for them causes them to help us in the whole battle. All right. All right. Now we have to talk a little bit about the serpent, although we don't want to talk about snake lore so much. A little bit, but not a whole lot. We don't want this to be all animals tonight. Can't say that I went to a talk last night and tried to hear about deep spiritual things, and all he did was talk about animals. All right. The serpent, of course, is another redundancy. It's cut up, which is another representation of distribution. It's also a repetition from last semester, because the serpent that is cut up and segmented is the great serpent Python that Apollo Pythias overcomes. And so we have to talk a little bit about serpent lore. Among other things, the serpent represents the passage of time. When it swallows its own tail, It represents eternity, or a closed time, or a complete and a whole time. It forms a complete ring in that way. In its linear, it shows linear time in its very slow peristalsis. You can actually see a snake swallow a gopher and see the lump move down the body of the snake very, very slowly. And peristalsis is just like linear time. It's continuous and it's smooth, but yet something is passing along in a regular, even way. Even the slithering of the snake in its spiral fashion, there are no stops. It's sort of a smooth passage from instant to instant to instant. In its coiling power, the snake represents spiral time. It represents the condensation of something into a very small amount of space from which it can spring out from. From which it can spring. I don't need a second from in there. My goodness, with sloppy talk. Especially talking about serpents. You have to be very careful when you talk about serpents. And clearly, the power of overcoming something and suffocating it by surrounding it, as in a python crushing something to death, shows again the whole nature of the spiral. Yet, the regeneration that takes place in time, the regeneration and renewal, is again shown by the serpent shedding its skin and having a brand new one coming out underneath. All of these put together show that the effects about snakes and serpents all represent different kinds of time. Eternal time, linear time, spiral time, all in one, in the same serpent. Oh, all right. That's all right. This night is not important anymore. It's going to be cool enough. We're not going to get too hot anymore tonight. So, the segmentation or the cutting up of the snake represents distribution in time. But since time is a different medium than space, we talked last week, last time we met, we talked about distribution both in time and space when we talked about days, months, and a year, and the 14 representing the whole cycle, and as well as the 13 new moons as the atoms of it. But now let's look at it in a different way. There's a big difference between the consciousness of time and the consciousness of space. In space, distribution is seen by having 12 around the 13th. And the difference is that in space, everything is seen simultaneously as a whole. Like a dodecahedron, you can see all the 12 at once. But in space, each has a unique point of view, but that unique point of view exists all at the same time. But that unique point of view, because they're all seen at the same time, they can't all be appreciated at the same time. You know, it's said that a picture, which is a spatial thing, is worth 1,000 words. But when you have a picture, when you see the whole, there's something about seeing all of the points of view in that picture at the same time that produces an illusion so that you don't look at all the different parts of it. When you look at the distribution in time as cutting the serpent into 12 different parts, you have the consciousness that is like the consciousness of spirit. Because the consciousness that is, matter is what fills space, and it's inert, and it has its stability and its apparent changelessness as its strength. Spirit is what fills the potential of time, and it has its liveliness as its means of accomplishment. So in the serpent being divided into 12 points, you have a logical, sequential succession and development, so that a moment or a delineation of time or a spiral of time is broken into different pieces, and you have the kind of consciousness of knowing, of logic, knowing that this came from that and it became this. And so there is a much different kind of consciousness in distribution in time than there is in the distribution of space. And that it's sort of like taking an idea and developing it through a line of music. That's a much different consciousness. Hearing something develop as a piece of music, which is very time-oriented, is different than seeing a piece of sculpture, which is very space-oriented. Yes, it's true that you have to walk around the piece of sculpture to see it from all of its various points of view to have it make sense. But the piece of music, you're actually inside it. The music surrounds you, and you go through the passage of time with it, and you have that development of consciousness that goes along with it. Okay. The tradition being carried on itself is a humanification, or what you might call an artistification of the spiral principle. When something is made into a rope, all of these strands are spun, and then the little sub-ropelets are themselves spun to make the rope. And there you have the principle of the spiral compounded. So when you have the companions of Horus cutting up the rope into pieces, you have a humanified process of it. Now, the companions of Horus is code. They're something like the Knights of the Round Table or the Peers of Charlemagne, or best case, the disciples of Jesus. They represent distribution, like when someone gets to the state of consciousness that is the whole, from both the center of the sun and the horse distribution and meditation throughout the whole, then when someone reaches that state of consciousness, they must distribute by teaching through the different facets, and that's why you always have a teacher distributed so that the teaching can be brought out in different ways to different people with different needs through the companions of Horus or through the disciples of Christ or such like that. The same principle exists in time and spirit and in space and matter and in consciousness in human beings who unite both space and matter. The cutting up of the rope also has another meaning which I didn't have time to go into and research, because the cutting up of the rope goes back to the idea of knots and cutting through knots, and it again deals with the passage of time with fire rather than light, because the Egyptians had rope clocks for the night, and the night was divided into hours by how long it took to burn through a rope. And cutting through the Gordian's knot was being able to cut into the instant, but I don't want to go into that. It's too much. I would want to research and be able to do it right. All right, back to the story. The fight between Horus and Typhon lasts for many days, probably a year, but it doesn't say so. And it is a seesaw battle. It's back and forth and back and forth. In some of the Egyptian, not the Plutarch variation, but in some of the Egyptian variations, what happens is that for a while Typhon even overpowers Horus and humiliates him homosexually. But in all variations, Horus eventually overcomes Typhon and, using the rope again, binds him, and he presents him to his mother Horus. The seesaw battle is just like the of creation, or like the struggle of our lives in becoming gods, is the same sort of thing. It's back and forth and back and forth, and that's the way it has to be. We have to put forth effort against resistance, and then if we slack off so that we can rest and withdraw our experience, the resistance comes back again, and we have to put effort forth again, and that's what it is. If there is no effort, there's no growth. If there's no effort, if there's no struggle, there's no creative glory. And probably the most important thing that we can learn in the spiritual life is that it is work. It is really hard effort, and that's necessary. Now, the reference to homosexuality, we can see why it would have been omitted by Plutarch. It's easy to understand that because Plutarch was a pretty straight-laced guy, and he was a responsible Greek, and the Greeks had already a terrible reputation for homosexuality, so you can see why he would omit it. But it's saying that this is a struggle of man with man. This isn't the wrestling match of man with woman. And it has to be that for this point of view of looking at the story. You could look at it the other way, but it would be a whole different myth. In order for there to be victory, and in order for there to be a decisive conflict, it has to be a male principle over a female principle, over another male principle. The homosexuality has to take place, because if it's a man against a woman, the woman always wins. It's a different kind of thing. In every what happens is the woman always wins, and they unite because the opposite polarities attract each other. They unify, and they fall into a deep sleep that results in a later creation. That's a whole different myth. But in order for there to be an objective, it has to be either female over female or male over male in order, therefore, there to be an objective consciousness. Horus had to take Typhon into him, whether he liked it or not. We not only have to wallow in the mud like the Urus, we actually have to take the mud into us. And when you think about it, when we're eating, that's what we're doing. The solid part of what we're taking into us is matter. And in that, there is a great evolutionary experience when we're taking matter into our body and alchemizing it. It's an evolutionary experience for the matter, because it gets to experience something much different than being a dumb old stone that just stands there and has the elements beating on it. It gets taken into and provides stability of form for a being which has its consciousness radiating right through it. And for us, if we are to redeem the earth, if we are to do the alchemical work of taking the base metals and turning them into spirit, if we are to take the soul matter out, we have to literally consume them. We have to take them inside of us. So what happens is that Horus does that and somehow finds the strength to not be overcome, but to himself overcome, and in spiral fashion, using a spiral rope, a many times spiral rope, he binds Typhon, and it is really an objective overcoming. Now, it's really interesting to note that since Typhon is the brother of Osiris, that they both have the same fate. Osiris gets bound into the casket. It's a different kind of binding. He gets bound into a casket and, in effect, dies. Typhon gets bound by a rope. And what happens, we'll see right now when we get back to the story. Hey, I'm having a ball. This is the time of my life, telling the same story a different time, having it be a totally different story than the first time. Is wonderful. I'd like to, maybe perhaps if I live old enough to develop far enough, I'd like to go through and do the Isis myth one more time from a totally different point of view, and maybe I will have more insight that I can see it in a totally different fashion. I have to read Don Quixote one more time, too. That's going to be my thing. I'm going to keep Don Quixote near me all of my life. And when the angel of death comes for me, I'm going to say, you can't have me yet. Because, for a man seeking wisdom, he's supposed to read Don Quixote 3 times. Once as a young man, which I did, and once as a middle-aged man, which I did, and once as an older man. And I'm going to hold it right near me, and I'm not going to let the angel of death get me until I read Don Quixote for the 3rd time. I don't know if I'll get a chance to carry that off, but I'd like to be a classical man. Yeah. All right. The funny thing is that when Horus presents Typhon to Isis, she doesn't do away with him. Instead, she unbinds him and she lets him go. And Horus is so enraged that he reaches up and he takes her crown off of her. But Hermes doesn't want to see her disgraced, so he makes her a headdress with cow's horns on it and puts it on her. You know those headdresses that the Egyptians have that hang down around the neck? He makes one for her with cow's horns and puts it on her. And afterwards, Horus and Typhon fight again 2 more times. They go through the same thing 2 more times. And each time the outcome is the same. Meanwhile, Isis has a union with the dead Osiris. She meets him somehow, the resurrected Osiris. She has a union with him, and she brings forth Harpocrates, who is known among the Egyptians as Horus the Younger. There is Horus the Elder, there is Horus, and there is Horus the Younger. Horus the Elder belongs to the very early dynastic gods, and then this Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris. And then there's Horus the Younger that is born of the dead Osiris and Isis. In the meantime, there is a legal battle because Typhon says Horus is a bastard. He says he's illegitimate. It's sort of like his sour grapes number on Horus. And they hold the court, and the gods all decide that Horus is the legitimate son of Isis and Osiris. And then what happens is Harpocrates is born as Horus the Younger. He's a strange child because he's born at 8 months rather than 9. And he's weak in his lower limbs, so the upper part of his body is strong and normal. And that's the end of the story. But it's not the end of the delineation of the story. It goes on for a while. The mother, Isis, represents the second attribute, whether in transcendence or in the phenomenal realm. She is the second, and one of the attributive qualities of the second is the preserver. It is the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer, and she is the preserver. So it's just not in character for Isis to destroy, especially her own brother. And that's because she is a preserver. This is why the male-female union, or the wrestling between, the struggle between male and females, is always fruitful, because there is a preserving. The life is never lost. However, you can say, though, that in producing form, she is introducing death, because forms must die, but also in the producing of that form, the new life is produced on a higher level. So the deeper the form that you produce, the more lively the life becomes. As the second attribute, Isis is also the mitigator. And since this is a struggle between spirit and matter, the higher and the lower, the eternal and the ephemeral, Isis must also be the mitigator between the eternal and the ephemeral. And the way this is done is that Isis represents the Word. That is the oscillating vibration. She mitigates between the ephemeral, the instant that is only here and then it's gone, and the eternal that is always here. She becomes the Logos by oscillating back and forth between the seemingly changeless eternal and the ever-changing ephemeral with its instantaneous changes. So much so that the oscillation approaches continuousness. So that what we're talking about here is a continuous binding and unbinding. So this is the way she fulfills her duty, by release and capture, release and capture, release and capture. This is how the Word is made. It isn't by holding our breath, and it isn't by throwing our breath out and leaving it out. It is by modulating on the in-breath, but now especially on the out-breath. It's kind of hard to talk on the in-breath, but it can be done. Neurotics do it all the time because they're trying to hold their breath and be strong. You see somebody who laughs on the in-breath. You see somebody who is neurotic and insecure about what they're laughing at. I used to laugh all the time on the in-breath, and I eventually got to understand what is going on. So this is the way she does her work. She balances all of this dominance. She balances between eternal being and momentary deaths, and then she mitigates between the two of these. Again, 3 iterations is enough to manifest this, because we have that way. There was a lovely book that was written, I believe, back in the 40s by George Gamow, who tried to popularize astronomy and in a way did it much better than the fellow from Cornell. But he wrote a book called 1, 2, 3, Infinity. And he noted that the primitives in Africa counted 1 too many. And he said, this may look like a primitive consciousness that can only understand 3 and no more. He said, but this same principle is applied by astronomers when they count infinities of stars. That these natives living in Africa should count 1, 2, 3 many is not an accident, because all of the Platonistic documents that were in the Library of Alexandria went off to Arabic and African chiefs, and they assimilated it. We wouldn't have all of the Platonism that we have. We wouldn't have the Enlightenment that came in the Renaissance if it weren't for the Arabs. So what we're talking about is distribution again. If we take the whole idea of counting to 3, which we spent many weeks on when we talked about Orphic cosmogony, we said that the distribution into many doesn't come until we have the 3rd attribute of the Spirit. Let's see, how are we going to do this? We'll come back to this in just a little bit. But the distribution is when you have the concept of an individuality, of a one, of a God, a being. That concept can be duplicated many times over. And so the famous Arabic conception of the one and the many is really a Platonistic conception of the noetic, noeric, and the noeric. And when the noeric is born, the many are born. When one is born, that one can be a humble one like us, or it can be the one that is the center of all ones, that is the divine. Now, the exchange of crowns, though it is dramatic and by an outraged Horus, is not a humilification. He's not humiliating his mother for letting him loose. He is like we are. You mean I have to do this all over again? I was a good boy yesterday. You mean I have to go back tomorrow and be a good boy all over again? That's that kind of rage that it was. You know, we've won, but that isn't enough. We got to win again and again and again and again. Many means that. You know, the starry crown represents Isis in the transcendent sense, the Divine Mother, who is the spiritual preserver. When she has loosed Typhon, she has aligned herself with her brother, meaning to say then she is then the soul mother. And the soul mother is the receptor and not the emanator from the light of the crown, which even goes right to the binah of the tree of light, the crown on the top of the tree of life in the Kabbalah. The binah is the second principle, which is the principle of light, just as the invisible darkness is the first principle of the Father. And so we have here in Isis taking on the soul function, the horns then representing the receiving from spiritual energy and transmitting them through the tresses down in the headdress. That represents exactly what function that she was taking, and Horus knows it, and that's the way things become. We may speak more about this next time. Now, what I found fascinating about this is that the fruitful unions of Isis and Osiris occur before the birth of Osiris and after the death of Osiris. They must have been some weird fetish kind of things, that they would only unite in the womb and after death. It's a most interesting thing. But what it really is a beautiful statement about the nature of spirit. We said a while back that spirit exists before God. That God as a being, as a focus known to those less than God like ourselves, or to that spirit above God. God is even God to God, because it is in that act of becoming a one that spirit knows the nature of spirit through God. Transcending the self, transcending the individual, the one, are the divine spirit and the life spirit. They are pure spirit. And as such, they cannot be a one. Therefore, the divine spirit represents Osiris, and the life spirit represents Isis. And the union of Isis and Osiris take place in the womb of the cosmos before the self, or before Horus is born, or before even an objectification of the divine and the life spirit is possible, which can only be possible when you have the viewpoint of the one. So it had to be that way. Their fruitful union that results in Horus had to be before their own birth. But the fact that we learn about this after the repeated battles of Horus and Typhon, once Horus has overcome Typhon in the deepest sense and relaxes, when he is released again in relaxation, the entire cosmos goes back into a state of chaos, or it is raised up to a higher level and the spiritual elements go into chaos. Meaning to say, Osiris is in the story already dead then. After this death in chaos, there is a reunion of Isis and Osiris. And though the cosmos is never born as deeply as it is when Typhon is this kind of hard stuff, it is reborn on another level again, and you then have the Horus being a new Horus being born as a sort of soul Horus on a less deep level of material manifestation, so that the next overcoming of Typhon is an easier overcoming because it is not that hardened kind of resistance. So it's a really beautiful statement about the whole of this. Like 3 times the earth has to be overcome before the overcoming is really done. And that goes right along with cosmology. That it's going to be reborn, but each time it's not going to be as deep. And each time, before the struggle, we're going to go back into chaos. And into chaos, there will be that statement where the pure spirit, everything is back in the pure spirit, and there is a reenactment of what happened before Horus was born in the first place. So it's quite a beautiful thing. I'm probably missing materials here, but we've been long enough. It's interesting that Harpocrates is born with weak lower limbs, meaning to say that the material world isn't as dense, isn't as strong, isn't as defined. The next time that the earth is born after this dissolution, the next time that it is born isn't going to be any more dense than liquid. And after that, the next time it's only going to be as dense as gas or as air. So that if there is a new Harpocrates born, a new Horus the younger again, it'll be even weaker below. There's also something about this that the limbs of Harpocrates also talk about the limbs of a triangle, and this has a deep Neoplatonistic meaning, but I didn't want to go into that because I thought this would be enough to talk about in one night. Now, because Typhon is the brother of Osiris, and Osiris represents the divine spirit, and Typhon represents the divine spirit in reflective projection as dense matter, he sees things backwards with the illusion of matter. He then sees the manifestation of Osiris in Horus in the image of Horus, and not Horus himself. He sees him as the physical being. That is the sun that we see out there, and he knows that the sun that we see out there is an illusion to the real, relative to the real Father of light, the real Horus, the real light. And he uses this illusion of inversion as a psychological stratagem. And he then questions the legitimacy of Horus. He says, you are born of the gods, you're fake, you're an illusion. You are a bastard. You are made out of phenomenal stuff. And so they have the court. If you look at it, though, really, in the truest sense, even the transcendental self, of the whole solar cosmos is an illusion. It is the direct representation of pure spirit, but it isn't pure spirit. And so that when you are seeing, or when you have any concept of God or any experience of God, you do have the illusion. Easy to work with. I haven't checked out any of the tapes. I better do that. I've checked out that it works. But since any conception of God, even spirits' conception of God is only a conception, there is some illusion in that, because no conception or no representation, even in a divine idea created by the divine in the union of Isis and Osiris, can really contain all of that. It truly is always ineffable. And so that, it always happens when there are disputes or arguments, there always is something true in every case. Now what happens is the gods decide the case in favor of Osiris. And this is because the gods live in that transcendent realm of the human spirit, which is the realm of ideas, and only the gods can judge, because judgment can only come when you have the conceptual understanding. If everything remained in pure spirit, there would be no judgment. And as illusory as the individuality may be, even if it is the divine individuality, as illusory as it may be, it is all important in giving us that faculty of judgment. And so the gods, because they judge, having experienced that which transcends even judgment or even the individuality, they know where that light comes from, and they know, even though there may be something illusory about it, then they have to judge in favor of Horus, and he has to be seen as legitimate. So they have what we would call knowing, in the sense of gnosis, and they can judge from their own knowledge. All right, so we have finally finished. I take this last little bit because I want to share it with a friend, or several friends actually, and there was something on there that the friend would certainly want to hear, so it's going to cost me a whole extra tape, but that's the way things go. We have finally finished the little story of Isis and Osiris. Next time, what we will do is we will take a little cultural divertimento on the Isis-Osiris myth, and then we will take the big ideas of triangularity and review them and try to carry them further and tie them together. And then we will try to take those ideas and tie them together with the ideas of triangulation that we garnered last semester when we were very fundamental in talking about the Oedipus myth, and talk about where the class would go next if we continued going forward with it. I still haven't decided whether I want to go one more year and talk about all the things with triangles that I want to, or whether I want to go and talk about the myths on the origin of evil. It's still a toss-up for me. And that's all we have for tonight. All kinds of questions?
It was Mercury that gave Isis her crown back?
Yes, but he never gave her the crown back.
I mean, he gave her the headdress.
He gave her the headdress, yeah.
Is that a symbol for Neptune?
Well, Mercury has those horns on it.
Mercury has horns also, yes. Yeah. Mercury is the...
Cow's horns,
For Isis, it is cow's horns.
Yeah.
In fact, I believe in some versions, I believe the head is cut off altogether and a cow's head is placed on Isis, but I'm not sure about that. I believe that has more to do with Apis. Zeus Apis, or Zeus Ammon Apis, or Osiris Apis. They blend so many gods together. The Egyptians are famous for their...
Osiris had an affair with Isis' sister?
Nephthys, yes.
And who was born?
What? That was Anubis. Yeah. The dog-headed god. Yeah.
So dogs are associated with death.
Yes.
What dogs?
Yes, death and intelligence. I think it has something to do with, every time you think you kill brain cells. And the head is very deathly, where the heart is very lively. And there's much more to this argument. You know, there's a big argument in medical circles now as far as harvesting organs and all those kinds of lovely things. When is a person dead? When they're brain dead or when they're heart dead? And that's a big fight. I come on down on the side of heart dead because the brain is dead all along. It is the other end, you know, the other depositing area, the fecal matter. Of course, it results in new creation. But yeah. Well, thank you very much.
I'm not clear about what Horus and Typhon represent. Typhon represents a different matter.
Typhon represents matter itself.
And Horus.
Horus represents that focus of light that is the individuality, the self, and the ego. It's the ego that.
Which ego? The
The lower kind of ego, the lower, what would be called the lower self, which would be associated with the visible. No, that Horus represents both suns. Just like the sun in astrology represents self with a capital S and lower self.
I didn't know that.
Sure, it's right in the middle. It's right in the middle here. Oops. The symbol of the sun is right in the middle of the lens of the mind. And on one half, if you look at this is why it's so tricky in astrology. By looking at the sun, you can see the transcendent spirit, but you can also see the egotism and all of those brash, self-centered things, because it is literally the eye of the soul where the soul sees into the phenomenal worlds, or where the lower soul sees up into the spirit. And so it is both an ascending hawk, the eye of Horus, and it is the eye of Horus descending. And the points of the triangle like that can almost be looked at as raptors beak.
I didn't realize that was also the higher ego as well as the lower ego.
Yes. Yes.
So was Horus and Zeus?
Yes, Horus corresponds to the Zeus-like figure as the demiurge.
Ways about Hickey says that our generation is characterized by Pluto and Leo as an esoteric rulership because that's what we're trying to achieve. That's the collective fire that we share. The Leo energy on an esoteric level. That's what we're looking to. Our destiny mission.
That's why it's so tricky, because when we really are being egocentric and being egoistic, we're basing it on the fact that we know that there's something divine working right in the center of our being. And we tend to sometimes, thinking from the egoistic way, we tend to pardon it because it's all right, because it's God's. And it's sort of a compromising way of treating God. I'm sorry I wasn't clear on that. See, that's why Typhon and the divine spirit, represented by Horus as the invisible, he comes out of the invisible to commune with, and the divine spirit is always invisible. It is so purely spiritual that it can't even manifest as spiritual light, but the power behind it is always invisible, and because of that, it has that ultimate power. It has to be so subtle that even light, and that is the light of knowing, of spiritual knowing, is too gross to represent it. And it's always represented as darkness. And that will, which commands all of creation, when that gets inverted, going through the lens from the transcendent to the phenomenal, the will then becomes the ultimate resistance, like this stuff. You don't just walk through this, and this is the resistance. And so the struggle is the oscillation back and forth of Osiris, of Horus, who represents Osiris. See, Horus is the representation of Osiris, just as God is a representation of that which can't be spoken of as spirit, and that is what struggles with the matter to overcome it and to take it into itself, and that is what amounts to the alchemization, where something that is unknown, because ignorance is stubborn. We talk about somebody being a stupid ass. And that's literally what Typhon is the physical world, or the material world, is where we take the dream from the known and we project it into the unknown, and in that we crystallize the unknown as a substance, and then in struggling with that substance back and forth over again and again, the unknown becomes known. You have to become familiar. And the homosexuality of Typhon with Horus is carnal knowledge. Carnal knowledge by taking matter into ourselves. She says, all right. I'm in a mood I'm in a nice relaxed mood tonight. I could go all night with questions.
I said Osiris, they had the same mother and father, right?
Yeah.
He got her pregnant inside before they were born.
Yeah.
And then there was a sister.
Yeah.
And then there's also a brother.
Yeah.
Now were all four of them in there?
There were 5, actually. See, it's been so long since we told the story. Maybe one of the things I should do is pull out all the sections and tell the whole story briefly in 5 minutes. Yes, they united. What happened is, remember, Re was married, and Seb united with Nut. Earth united with heaven. This is on the sly, and Re didn't know about it. And then later on, she had an affair. Who was the third affair with? I believe it was with Thoth. Yes, with Thoth. And then she bore 5 children. There was Isis, Osiris, Typhon, Nephthys, and the elder Horus, which wasn't talked about here. We could get into the very sophisticated. I decided not to take the elder Horus into the whole business. It would have been like Vedantin metaphysics, very subtle and layer upon layer of the same principles. It would be sort of like a para-self that existed before the self is born, which had to be there in the first place. And it's all there. You can, if you ponder the cosmoconception, you can find the same ideas right within the cosmoconception. But it's deep slugging. It's hard work all the way through. And they were all born, and they were each. Remember when Hermes bargained to get the pieces of the days, and then they were each born on one of the 5 days. And Typhon wasn't born through the womb, but he kicked himself out through the side, meaning to say that the dense matter was born in a very illegitimate way. We looked at it as being the radical of the side of an isosceles right triangle. We looked at the spiritual geometry because we were looking at triangles at that time, since this is nominally about triangles. And we did that instead. We could have looked at the way matter came to be born by being kicked out of the side, meaning to say that the outside world as we see it now is illegitimate, in that it's the only thing that has an outside that we can't really see the inside to. But the gods and all the spiritual beings see only the inside of matter, but they don't get to see the outside. And so there is an illegitimate, strange, took a side trip kind of thing with this external matter, and our fall into matter, or our fall into the realm of Typhon, was so that we would have this exclusively external viewpoint. So we are as much renegades and womb busters as Typhon was.